Hello, and welcome to this sixth episode of Creator Spotlight from the Interface. Creator Spotlight is our brand new series where we talk to creators about what they make and do and how they got started. Today's episode will be a little bit different from the most. Usually we speak to creators, but wireless is such a fascination of mine, I had to get David on the show to talk about what he does. Today I'm joined by David Theodore from Climate Resilient Internet. David has worked in the microwave and wireless industry since the late 80s and was part of the team responsible for the first microwave link. So welcome, David.
Thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, great. It's WISPs and the whole internet, wireless internet as a whole, is such a deep fascination of mine. It's where I got started in my career, so it's something I just had to get you on to talk about because it's such an interesting topic. So,
hmm
um, for people that don't know much about you, where did, what's your background and how did you get started in the wireless industry?
How I got started was I was working for MCI Telecommunications, which was the company that broke up AT&T, um, and we were selling competitive phone access. And back then we had just a monopoly here, and there was no way around them. So MCI was the first competitive carrier, and so I sold service for them. I took the job. It was straight commission. I had a political science degree. There's nobody would have hired me. So that's my background, and I fell in love with telecom. I mean, it was like a time where there were some really explosive developments, and huge industries were born. And we had a guest speaker one day that came in and talked about microwave bypassing and mentioned how one day companies that are completely beholden to telco will have some autonomy, will be able to save money, will be able to um, have their own communications links. This was all pre-fiber. So I was really intrigued by the payback, and the fact that with AT&T divested, now some of these competitive technologies, could be marketed. And so it was exciting. And I got into the business 6 months later as a reseller, and convinced the manufacturer, at that time it was Maycom, to front me money to go out and start to market microwave links to business consumers that were paying thousands and thousands of dollars for T1 lines, mainly because they cross telephone exchanges, but it could only be a few miles. So anyway, I'm spending too much time on that. Um, but at the same time that I was getting into the business, I was hearing about token ring and Ethernet, and new developments coming. I was in Kendall Square, literally blocks away from some of the very first um, domains on the internet, like Symbolics. They were the world's first URL. Thinking Machines, DEC, Bo Brannick and Newman, which had a lot to do with launching the internet. And so, I was in the middle of a lot of people talking about where the industry was going. And I got this incredible bug to have a microwave link come out with an 802.3 interface and be able to connect to an Ethernet network. I was absolutely certain that Ethernet was going to take over and dominate, that token ring was probably going to fade away, and that pretty much everything was going to be standardized onto this, onto the Ethernet spec. And so I went and talked to radio manufacturers about, whether or not they could do such a thing, and nobody was interested. They all thought it was a niche.
Hmm.
And they were right. I was way too early for the market. But I was also in my 20s, and no one could tell me no. And so I had pretty much taken all my proceeds from sales and hired a couple of engineers as contractors. One guy had a terrific background in land development, hardware and software, and the other guy was a radio guru. And the three of us put our heads together, and 9 months later, we had this interface, and it was the world's first fixed wireless access solution. And what was exciting is that um, even back then, if customers like had any skepticism about wireless, and this is just really when people were first getting cell phones, And cell technology was terrible. I mean, there were very few cell sites, so calls were dropping all the time. But people couldn't afford to be skeptical about wireless because we were the only way for so many institutions to get their first internet access and to extend that access to remote campuses. And so, back then, most of our early clients, like MIT, Harvard, UCal, Berkeley, they were thinking if this works even marginally, it's going to be awesome. But it worked better than marginally. It worked flawlessly. We had the famous
Yeah.
5.9 performance, and we were providing 10 megabit connections when the internet backbone was 10 megabits. So even if you somehow could get fiber with a snap of a finger or throw millions of dollars at it, you weren't going to get anything more than what we were already delivering. So we ran with that all through the late 80s and through the 1990s, um, until 802.11 came out. Cisco was getting a lot of attention for being in that business, and even though their solution was substandard and only providing a 2 megabit connection, it was Cisco, so like you know they had a huge following, still do. And then of course fiber started to become available everywhere, and it was really cheap. Um, and internet backbone speeds went up to 100 megs and gigabit. So there were a lot of there were a lot of changes. But what's interesting is the way wireless was used in the first part of my career, because it was used for backhaul, which is the same way that we use fiber optics today. And
Yeah.
so, where early institutions got their first internet access by fixed wireless, um, the fixed wireless would stay in place oftentimes, even when fiber came in, for backup, or maybe there was some kind of hybrid solution. And many years ago, you would look at the rooftop of a telco building or a data center, and you'd see hundreds, like, you know, dozens or hundreds of microwave antennas, like at 60 Hudson Street in Manhattan. They had, I mean, the roof was absolutely covered in dishes. And so many people were getting to the internet by fixed wireless. Well, today, there's really no wireless backhaul business to speak of. We don't use wireless that way. We use fiber for backhaul, and we're now using wireless not for enterprise, not even much for cellular backhaul, but for residential. Um, but what today's WISP community isn't aware of is that at one time, enterprise absolutely loved fixed wireless, and they will again. It's going to be an enormous, an enormous opportunity for us.
Definitely. So that very first product that you helped develop, what I'm just interested, what frequency was that running on at the time?
Great question. It was all 23 gigs.
Okay,
Yep.
that's still quite a popular frequency really in backhaul stuff. It's got quite a good compromise against lower frequencies, the cost of licensing. So was that license free at the time or
No, it was licensed. Uh,
okay?
we had to get a radio specially type accepted. It was an analog radio. It was a video, cable TV broadcast radio. So it was wideband video and then audio channels. And so basically, the bandwidth went out to like 6.8 megs, and we had to clear that out to give us 10 megs with some space on either side. And so basically, we modified an analog video radio, had it type accepted at the
Wow.
FCC, and those were the first fixed wireless access radios.
So you used a very small slither of 10 megahertz of spectrum.
Yep, yep.
Yep.
It was 1 bit
And
per
what?
hertz, and it worked beautifully. The limitation was actually Ethernet propagation delay. It wasn't the radio itself. Like
Okay.
most people would say, oh, well, the radio was a limiting factor because 23 gig isn't so great in weather, and so you have to keep your path distances short. But back then, to keep within the 802.3 propagation delay allowance, which was like 46.4 microseconds, give or take, um, we had a 4.3 mile distance limitation. Later, we worked with Cisco and modified our interface so that so that it was full duplex end to end, and then we no longer really had to worry about the delay budget. And so then at that point, the limitation became 23 gigs. But of course, we could repeat the signal.
In the times when you launched the first 23 gig product, how many iterations did it go over until before the 802.11 standard? Was there any major developments in speed or in that time period? Or
Interesting question. So, what we did first was we just created the interface, and the interface was called the EtherWave transceiver. Occasionally, I still find them on eBay. Somebody's like, I have this. It's a rack-mounted unit,
yeah,
1 inch tall, 19 inches wide, and I'll see them on eBay. So at first, we created that interface, and that interface connected to the radio that we modified. But the radio that we modified wasn't ours. It was owned by a company in Connecticut called International Microwave. They're no longer in business. So we had to deal with them to use their radios. In the span of time before 802.11, we ended up making our own radios because we were in a constant pissing contest, excuse me, with the radio manufacturers, because the problem back then is radio people knew nothing about Ethernet in the LAN environment, nothing at all. And so, if anything went wrong, they immediately wanted to point at our EtherWave transceiver and say, well, we don't have the design to that. We don't know exactly what it's doing,
Sure.
that kind of thing. So ultimately, we got tired of, basically fighting that fight, and we could see the economics as we were growing into, to make our own radio. And then once we made our own radio, there were different versions of radio that we made, because back at that time, radios were all or nothing. Everything was packed onto one board. So oftentimes, if you had a problem in the field, you had to replace really seriously expensive components. And so, we broke our radio down into 5-inch high boards. And so, we could just replace a power supply board, an IF board, or something like that. The boards were a couple of $100. We could, carry them in service kits. But the other thing that we did as well was we made our own bridges, because back at the time, most of our customers were connecting to Cisco routers, and routers then were like $25,000 an end. But the only other way to connect local and remote networks was to either go through a repeater, in which case, like, all the traffic from one building was going to the other side,
Yeah.
or to use a bridge to filter out local and remote addresses. And so the only bridge at the time was made by DEC, and their bridge was like 10 grand an end. And so we were ending up with problems where so much of the cost of delivering our solution was in the interfaces. So then we also made our own bridge, which which was better than the DEC bridge at the time. And so, we could make it for $1,200, sell it for $2,400, like reduce $10,000-$15,000 off a link cost. So there were those kinds of things that we did. But the real mistake that we made is that when the internet backbone went from 10 megs to 100 megs, I made a transfer of technology deal with Motorola in lieu of getting in bed with venture capitalists who could have accelerated our R&D and gotten us to the next step. But I thought that it would be better to team up with Motorola, where I would keep 100% of my company and grow in partnership with Motorola. But Motorola sold the division that we had our technology agreement with like a year after we consummated it. And so that went buns up. And then I had some learning experiences, which brought me to this day.
Sure. Is that division they sold? Is that what became Cambian Networks, or is that something a lot later on?
That's a really interesting question, Alex. telesciences, uh, they seem to have had something with the start of cambium. I never quite connected the dots, but it's interesting that you said that, because that kind of um, reaffirms that there may be something
Yeah.
um, that's really interesting, because in some way, then maybe our early technology ended up in cambium's hands.
It potentially. I know some of the development of the Ubiquiti Air Fiber. I remember watching a video from when that was announced in 2013. A lot of the original guys that developed that product for them came from Motorola as well. So I wonder if there's some sort of splitting of knowledge. I'm not sure. So I remember that Ubiquiti set up a complete new R&D team in Texas. I think I can't remember what it was, but to develop the Air Fiber when it came out. So
Yep.
maybe there's bits and pieces of your stuff out there. So,
Well, of
but yeah,
course,
no,
I was using analog radios, and the whole world went to digital radios.
sure,
But interestingly, the analog radios were actually far better in the early years of digital radios, and we still had quite a market hold for that reason, because this was before radios gracefully stepped down in modulation. When the path became attenuated. So now, if you have a huge rainstorm that impacts your transmission, your your bandwidth will degrade.
yeah,
Well, back then there was no such mechanism, or else it was really rudimentary and it didn't work well. And so with analog radios, we never completely cut out. The signal would degrade, but Ethernet automatically retransmitted, and on the whole, customers wouldn't be aware at all. Whereas with digital radios, they would just flat out shut down, and customers had to recycle everything. The digital
yeah. It's
cause everything to lock up.
yeah. It's sort of gone backwards a little bit. So if you've got a routed network and you've got radio links on them, getting the routed network that's actual hardware like switches and routers to play nicely with the radio links.
Mhm.
If the radio manufacturers have had to put software bits in place to say once you've got to a certain modulation level, just kill this link and we can let the routing protocols take over. So maybe they've had to sort of go backwards a little bit. So
What I remembered was that the digital links would crap out, and then basically there would be this cascading network effect, where the IT managers would then have to go around and just basically power cycle, their bridges, their switches, routers, and everything else, and it would be something that would keep people down for 45 minutes at a time.
definitely. So you mentioned that when the switch over to digital radios, it's not something that microwave bypass did.
Nope.
What led to the ultimate? What led to the end of it, basically? So
The end of microwave bypass.
yeah,
Well, there was nothing, nothing catastrophic. It was a frog in a frying pan kind of thing, where, you know, actually we were caught with another force, which was the dot-com bubble. So at a certain point, I decided that I was going to get out of the business of selling to enterprise end users, because we were doing installations in 46 states and in 6 countries. We literally were flying people all over the country to do installs. At a certain point, the economics just weren't there. And, we had friends in companies like EXO, um, where, they were talking to us about, well, they could deploy these radios for us in their account base, in their networks. And, we were going to go from singular quantities to dozens and hundreds. And then the dot-com bubble burst right at that time that I was trying to make that transition. And I remember going into to see C-level employees at these big companies, and they'd pull me around the corner by the coffee machine or whatever, and give me their card and say, call me if you hear of any good opportunities out there. And I was like, oh, holy crap! So I was trying to figure out, like, well, how do we still stay relevant? Um, but what ended up happening was I learned something, a really hard lesson that today's WISPs are only now starting to learn. um, which is I got to see bandwidth become a commodity. In when I talk about the frog in the frying pan, it's that I was making less and less money, and I didn't realize until it was too late that the business was basically untenable. I mean, I couldn't stay in it anymore. In the early years, even after microwave bypass, I was doing consulting, and some interesting projects. Um, but I had kind of counted on my major accounts always remembering me and always remembering that I was all about reliability. My mantra at that time it was all about reliability. Like when you think about the cost of your connection, you've got to factor in, you know, uh, the the anticipated cost of downtime as well, which is a huge cost that nobody really was thinking about. So, if you think you're saving money buying from the discount provider down the street that doesn't have any experience, and you think you're saving 7 grand on their quote, and you have a day and a half long outage that costs you $50,000, right? So, surprisingly, Alex, people just really weren't buying into that discussion anymore. And it was just like, look, your competitor's willing to do this for 25% less, so sharpen your pencil. I don't know. I've always been kind of prideful about my work. And so I was like, no, I'm not going to sharpen my pencil. I don't want to be the lowest price provider. That's not where my head is at. And so
Sure.
I actually started to get out of the business, and um, it was heartbreaking. Nobody knows me. I mean, everything I did was before anything was digitized for Google. Nobody cares about like 1980s and 90s trade journals, So I literally didn't know what I was going to do with myself. And so then I started a blog and I was writing on LinkedIn and, you know, basically just giving my opinions and on what I was seeing happening in the industry. Um, and, um, yeah. And so one thing led to another. And I ended up finding out, essentially how to save this industry. And I don't mean that like in a, God forbid Kanye West, Kanye kind of way. I don't mean like save it, like, oh, but I have a solution based on a lot of years of observing this industry, and I really think that it's like the way um, to save a lot of small providers, a lot of small WISPs. I think it's a way to enlarge our industry, not just to make us more competitive, but to make the playing field 10 times larger so that there's so much more for all of us um, to you know to eat, to feed our families. There's a huge amount of business out there, um, and I think that I've tapped a vein um, in in looking at um, extreme weather and making the connection there between extreme weather, climate change, and telecom infrastructure.
Yes. So with climate resilient internet, that's still new.
Mm-hmm.
The new venture you're doing.
Yep.
It's definitely an important thing to look at because I can't exactly remember what country it was, but there was some sort of storm or natural disaster in the islands in between Mexico and the US. I think there's some islands there, and I remember there was a lot of very fast-paced work to get their infrastructure back up and running.
Yep.
And they used a lot of Ubiquiti equipment, I think, to get themselves back up and running. Within days, I think they got most of things running again by licensed or unlicensed backhauls. So
Yep.
it's definitely an important thing. I've noticed. I remember we had a discussion before the podcast that wireless backhaul is used less and less in cellular. I've noticed that in the UK a little bit as well. So you see cell towers or phone towers that are out and about, and they usually have a lot of microwave links on them. Less the ones I see regularly, they've now got them taken down. They're probably using fiber as backhaul, which is interesting. So
Well, we live in an all fiber world. This is what most people don't understand. They think, like, oh, everything's wireless, but everything isn't wireless. But before your cell phone gets to the internet, it's got to push through a lot of fiber optic cabling. And moreover, it's dependent on an aging, failing, overtaxed electric grid, you know. Um, and it's interesting. I was out at Wispapalooza a couple of weeks ago, and I gave a talk. Uh, a lot of WISPs, I would hazard to say most WISPs in our industry think that enterprise, doesn't take fixed wireless seriously, and they're not ready to buy into it, and that it's too hard to break into that business. But I have news for them. I think that that's 100% wrong. I think that they have to know how to sell to enterprise, and I think that we need to wake the world up about how we access the internet and why that access is so fragile, and why that access is so vulnerable. This isn't just an IT problem. This is a problem for all of us, because no matter who you are, you have to depend on the internet working and on organizations' critical infrastructure reaching the cloud, or else you're not flying in an airplane when you get to the airport, and you're not getting critical medical attention when you get to a hospital. There's so many functions in our day-to-day life that are tethered to the cloud, and those cloud connections can be 27 miles away from where the client is. So people need to understand that, understand what the problem is, and the problem really is that extreme weather is coming for terrestrial infrastructure, telephone poles, cable, power cable. That's all fodder for extreme weather. And it's not to say that it's bad. It's critical. We need it. I mean, I love fiber. Without fiber, we wouldn't have the internet. Um, and that's what we're actually doing. Our mission is to take data from vulnerable areas, floodplains, and hazard zones, and ferry that data to high and dry ground, to resilient internet data centers where clients can reach the cloud, and they can also get out through the internet on known good lit fiber. So, I mean, the message that we have is that we don't need to lose critical communications in a natural disaster. We all know that's the worst time in the world to lose communications. And so far, we've been willing, somehow to deal with it. I think because we're inured to it. I mean, we've grown up this way. We understand that, oh, well, that just happens. But what's different from how we grew up is that every day organizations become more critically connected to remote cloud data. So those last mile connections are critically important to all of us. And so what we're doing, we liken to lifeboats for the internet, you know, um, or you can even say seatbelts. And you can argue with the efficacy of it. And, my answer to that is that seatbelts work. They don't work 100% of the time. Um, Sometimes there's a tragedy where somebody actually dies when they're wearing a seatbelt, but we don't say, "Oh, forget your seatbelts." Um, and so when you study the, when you study backhaul and how we reach the internet and what our internet infrastructure is, and different means of communications, then logically, you know, you get to that. Like fixed wireless backhaul is the only way you can move large volumes of data outside of cable. You can't do it with satellite. Um, you know, and so this is something that we're trying to both raise awareness to and get people to adopt. In the future, we're going to see this, I believe, as new best practices for internet connectivity in the age of climate. Um, and we will not have critical communications outages because we'll always have some level of resilience. The thing we need to stop doing is waiting until the what hits the fan and then showing up with cows and colts, cell on wheels and cell on light trucks. Those are great solutions. We've had them since the 1990s. But that's not, it's too little too late. We can't wait. We can't roll those out days after a calamity and then take 2 days long, 2 days more to hook them up, get generators out to them, fuel them, find good fiber to get us back. That stuff needs to now be baked in to our telecom infrastructure. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. I don't know much I can share, but where I used to work at the Wisp, I worked there for about 7 years. We It was primarily wireless since it got started, but then we made the shift into fiber, and as we made the shift into fiber, we actually had numerous locations with two levels of uplink. We had a fiber uplink to a nearby exchange or telephone place, and we also have an existing backhaul wireless as well. So we'd actually have two places of
Yep,
exit to the internet, and that was common practice. We did it was simply because that the fiber backhaul would take longer to install.
hmm
But as we realized, as we were both running together, we realized that's probably quite a good idea to have both running, and the license cost of the fixed wireless sort of out as you said earlier, the cost of installing something outweighs the money you'd lose afterwards. So the cost of the
absolutely.
license sort of outweighed the downside of it.
Absolutely.
So
I
yeah,
love I love that you said that that was kind of like best practices to have wireless backhaul, as a backup to fiber to keep that in place. In the 1990s, it was like a 15-minute time where the term mixed media backup was in vogue, and everybody was talking about it. And the whole premise was that if your most critical communications was running on terrestrial infrastructure, cable across telephone poles or underground, and in particular, you didn't know how it was routed or whether there was a single point of failure, that you needed to have wireless backhaul. But what ended up happening is that the fiber industry came out with 100% SLAs and really very, very well sold the public on, or I should say the buyers, on the idea that if you have enough fiber in the ground, if it's redundant enough, if it's diverse enough, if you have diversity in your routes, if you go to different data centers, that you're completely protected. Nothing's going to happen to you. And that is absolutely false. And this is the one line, I'm the first one to say this, and I want it on my tombstone because it might be the only sensible thing I've said, which is fiber is a single point of failure. Now, you can qualify that further and say for extreme weather. I actually don't even need the qualifier, but this is what I want to tell my WISP friends, that they need to tell their biggest clients. Do not sleep well on 100% SLAs. 100% SLA just means you don't have to pay for the service when it's down. Doesn't mean it's not going to go down. And the news that we have, and we see it, there's evidence all the time. Fiber fails, the power goes out, fiber fails, the streets are flooded, fiber fails, wildfires hit a region, fiber and power fails. So it's a single point of failure, and it doesn't matter how diverse or redundant your fiber is. If we still are only have one utility provider, one electric company, right? It really doesn't matter. And the other thing is, we all know that telecom lacks transparency. I mean, here in the US, if you have fiber and you're a big client, you don't know how your fiber is routed. And when you're buying redundant and diverse fiber, you don't know how redundant and diverse that is. Telcos never give you a fiber map and say, well, this is where these fiber strands go, and this is where those go. And so often, we talk to a client, and the client finds out, oh wow, we have all this diverse fiber, but it all comes under this footbridge, that goes into our property. So, I mean, the point of the matter is that fiber is the best way to reach the internet, but we cannot rely on it 100% of the time. And if we have critical data where public health and public safety depends on it, corporate fortunes, regional economies, we have to get serious about resilience and actually do it. You know, this is how I got back in the business, Alex. Um, and I don't want to digress much, but I was really, really depressed, and I was done with this business. And an environmental friend offered to buy me drinks if I went to a climate conference with him. So I went to this 2 hour climate conference in Boston, and it was all about climate resilience. And I'm not and never was an environmentalist. Not that there's anything wrong with it. I love the environment, but I had no background in it. But I'm listening to like all these big shots flown in from around the world talking about how they're making energy more resilient, how they're making wastewater treatment more resilient, how they're making public health more resilient, how they're making transportation more resilient. And not one of them talked about information, critical data, or how much of their operation actually vitally depends on data access.
Hmm.
And so, what I want to tell my WISP friends is, if you're not making a lot of money, we need to question the value proposition. We're in a commoditized industry because, we're delivering internet access for Netflix. Yes, also for people who work at home. Yes, also for students to do their homework. But it's commoditized. How much bandwidth for how little money. It's not hypercritical. And so, you know, where I told you before, I don't want to be the lowest cost bandwidth provider. I actually want to be the highest cost bandwidth provider. Me and all of our friends and partners, we are going to be selling the highest price premium bandwidth because we are making that bulletproof, right? We want to be paid based on quality and criticality. We want to be paid because we keep critical industries and places like hospitals and airports from going down. And the one probably the biggest objection I get to wireless backhaul is that it's a toy compared to fiber. Like, oh, well, I have 100 gig backbone. What are you going to do for me with wireless? Well, you know, the lifeboats on the Titanic couldn't take the napkins and the silverware and the furniture, but they saved 700 people. So what wireless backhaul can do is, if you have a 100 gig backbone and you're on the coast of Boston in a floodplain running a hospital, I can give you 30 gigs of data access with 80 millimeter wave radios. And arguably, every critical function in your hospital will run as always. You may not be able to stream, um, uh, you know, video into 600 patient rooms. There are certainly areas that you're going to compromise. QoS is going to have to be a big priority, setting that up. But the point of the matter is that, again, this is lifeboats or seatbelts for critical data for the new world of extreme weather.
It's not just extreme weather though. I'll just jump back to the air fiber again. So when the air fiber was announced, they had that demo video. It was the people talking about how they developed it and that sort of thing. And their main selling point for air fiber was it's going to stop copper theft. So they were saying, look, if you got a massive fiber run crossing lots of different environments that you have no control over, what's to stop someone who's after copper to slice open the fiber cable and realize, oh, it's fiber, and then they leave a lot of stuff offline. Their main selling point was, why not store two air fibers or two backhaul links and have the points where they are secured and are locked away, and you can deliver deliver bandwidth if you need to. So
Right.
that was the main. I think it helped a lot of, not just it will help the environment disasters that happen, and also the
Yep.
the opportunities as well. So
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. This isn't just about extreme weather. This is also a solution for terror attacks on telecom infrastructure as well. Like, we had an AT&T building that was bombed, and we also saw during 9/11 how telecom infrastructure at the lower part of Manhattan was completely devastated. And what happened after that? Hundreds and hundreds of fixed wireless links came into service. But again, we have to stop doing that. We have to stop bringing that after the fact. We have to bake that in beforehand. I also want to mention, by the way, because um, a big question comes up, like, who's going to pay for that? And the interesting thing is that clients are all paying for it right now. Um, Before we launched our business and came out of stealth mode, we did a few years of research and talked to hundreds of CIOs for major companies across the country, and they admitted, almost to a person, that they overbuy fiber on the whole belts and suspenders thing, where it's almost like you can't go wrong buying too much fiber, because the more you have, the more protection you have. Well, our thinking, for new best practices is actually no, peel back some of that investment that's not resilient, that's not going to work for you. Take that money that you're spending now that arguably is wasted, you know, because there's a better way to do it, and shift that money over to the fixed wireless solution. Now, the last part of that, Alex, is that, one of the reasons why fixed wireless has never really taken off um, is because after my time and after the time that everything was so serious in fixed wireless, I mean, you needed an FCC license to touch microwave radios. Today, anybody can pull that stuff out of a box, turn it on, connect it up, and the customer makes a decision on the technology based on their experience with that particular installation and that particular brand of radio. They don't know how to distinguish between anything. And so if you have a provider that doesn't have much experience, or they're a jack of all trades and they've only, and like one day they're installing a wireless link and the next day they're doing a home stereo, well, they're going to do a shitty job. And so when weather happens, the link's going to go out, or any number of things can happen. And then you have people disparaging fixed wireless and saying, oh, I don't really feel comfortable with that technology. I like a physical medium. So the other thing that we're doing as part of Climate Resilient Internet is that we've created and we're continuing to develop and evolve a best practices standard that all providers need to get on, so that we're all on the same quality and execution page. And in fact, we are certifying providers according to their ability to administer and execute on this standard, so that we are absolutely done with bad fixed wireless stories. They can be other people's problems, but we're not going to hear it. We're not going to answer those questions. And in the future, what we want to sell is a certified solution. And the question to the customer isn't, do you want fixed wireless? They don't even have to know it's fixed wireless. We're selling resilient internet and cloud bandwidth. The question is, do you want or do you need to be resilient or not? You know, it's not, do you need a fixed wireless backhaul solution? The answer is, if you have critical data and stockholders that expect you to be in business, or patients that need you to work on them, you have to have this. So now imagine, Alex, if that catches hold. So then fixed wireless backhaul becomes like generators, like power generators, where there are many industries in the US where power generators are mandatory, because it's understood that these industries serve the public. They can't go down. Well, how long do you think it's going to be before there's also a data mandate? Because what good is power backup if you can't access your data?
Yeah, definitely. The Whisper used to work at, the lot of the backhaul we used a couple of years ago. There was basically the only fiber we had was the links back to the data centers. So all the remote Wisp towers and that sort of thing, they're all fed with backhaul license radios. So we used a manufacturer called Ceragon.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Ceragon produce a lot of. They also produce fixed wireless radios for Cambium as well. So Cambium have a range of licensed radios, and they're not Cambium; they're just rebranded Ceragon. So
I think Cambium now makes their own radios. Yeah, this was actually, it was a wild learning experience for me, in the early aughts and whatnot, because I always made my own radios, and when it came to 100 meg radios, I was thinking, oh, I'll have to have $5, $6, $8 million of R&D money. I didn't realize until too late that there was a company called Remic that was making virtually everybody's ODUs at the time. It was like 85% of all the microwave manufacturers were really just writing their own interface software and buying radios from elsewhere. But yeah, Ceragon's a great radio manufacturer.
They're fantastic. Yeah, yeah. They used to. I know you're on about the analog radios used to have. They used to have an indoor unit as well. So Ceragon's earlier products actually had an indoor unit as well. So rather than everything being on the back of the dish, they had the indoor unit with like a rack mount device. So
well, the wireless backhaul business is dead. It's dead. I don't know what the figure is for how big it is, but I don't hear about it. I almost went out of business trying to sell wireless backup. Did I say
Hmm.
backhaul is dead or backup? I meant to
You
say
said backup,
wireless
I think. Yeah.
backup, right?
Yeah.
Wireless backup as a business proposition died a long time ago. I want to bring it back, but I don't want any of our providers, to ever use the term backup because it's a pejorative term. It's like it almost automatically means subservient, secondary. But there's nothing backup about this. This is about resilience. And we like to say that this is part of the new primary telecom infrastructure, and as such, it's not just sitting there waiting for a bad day to turn on or to find out whether or not it works or not. It's always carrying its share of production data. So presumably it also helps to pay for itself in the course of the year. But then when the other, terrestrial infrastructure goes down, it's up. But I wanted to ask you that question, Alex, because, you know, I'm not alone in understanding that properly installed, hardcore, wireless can withstand, even the most severe storms. And I had friends during Hurricane Sandy time, for instance, and we all talked afterward about like, oh, well, I had these clients that never went down. Time Warner was one of my clients in Manhattan, and we had them routed through 60 Hudson Street, and they were carrying PBS information. It was a Hispanic information and telecommunications network, and they never went down because they were routed through 60 Hudson Street, the famous data center, and that data center stayed up. They never skipped a beat. They're a tier 4 data center. They're paid to be resilient. So, my friends and I were all talking about like how remarkable it was that, hey, this is amazing. And we knew it was possible, and we had a story to tell, but nobody wanted to hear that story because everybody was like, oh, that's never going to happen again. We're never going to see that kind of storm again. But today, we're seeing those storms and we're seeing heat waves and wildfires, and things that are constantly putting the internet down. Um, and this is the last part of a lot of what we talk about, which is like going back to the lack of transparency in our industry. Nobody truly knows how often the internet fails. Um, you can find out how often power utilities fail because that's public information. But what's not public information is how often your carrier fails, how often the fiber goes down, why does it go down, how long does it stay down for, what brought it back up. All of this information is not information we're privy to. So if you wanted to do a vulnerability assessment for a city to find out like, oh, where are your critical assets and how vulnerable are you, you can do a vulnerability assessment for power, but you can't do one for telecom because if you're a civil engineer used to the science of constructing vulnerability assessments, you don't have any data to go on. How convenient, right? So you can't in a spreadsheet say, oh, well, according to data that I obtained, we had 3,787 internet outages of this duration in this region for that reason. There's no such information. So we need to actually start to train civil engineers to be able to not skirt their responsibility to recognize that telecom vulnerability is part of their vulnerability assessment. That's not just for IT folks. Telecom infrastructure is infrastructure. And the civil engineers that are doing vulnerability assessments for airports and for FBI buildings, and for Department of Defense and military installations, they need to start thinking about telecom infrastructure in the same breath that they're thinking about electrical infrastructure, which pretty much goes hand in glove. And they fail the same time, often for the same reasons. So, you know, this is innovation, Alex, even though there's nothing new being invented here. this is a whole new way of thinking about telecom.
Sure. Yeah. It's an important thing to talk about. So the the other thing we spoke about was that maybe the wisp industry isn't as big as it used to be, but they. So personally, I follow Ubiquiti quite a lot, and we've talked about it a few times now. It's good to see that they've come out with a whole new line of fixed wireless point to point and point to multipoint products, and for a company that they are now that are doing a lot of enterprise Wi-Fi stuff, the fact that they're putting their focus back on the wisp industry, and they've got a whole new product line, software line, and even billing systems that are free of charge for the wisp industry is really encouraging to see, especially with the size and breadth they are and the markets they're in. They've got a whole new line of 60 gigahertz point to multi-point stuff that's
Mhm.
out. They've got UISP, which is their device manager software. It's got billing, and it's all given for free to WISPs, which is obviously they're hoping that you buy their products, but
Right.
they've got a whole new development in WISP products, which is really good to see. So
Well, Ubiquiti's been out for a long time. As you know, they didn't start as a WISP proposition. They didn't start to help WISPs close the digital divide. Um, their business was basically to connect the unconnected around the world in developing nations. And I think still that's where their proposition, along with Starlink, is strongest. Um, I don't think that their product line was appropriate for use in the US. I mean, it was in the early days of the WISP industry, but then the noise floor at 2.4 and 5 gigs grew out of control. Um, and there were some things that helped to tame that, but there were manufacturers out there, and Ubiquiti is one of them, that weren't working on taming the noise floor. They weren't thinking about that at all. And I mean, for that reason, I'm a super big fan of RF Elements.
yeah,
And talk about innovation and talk about it not necessarily being anything new. They brought back horn antennas that people hadn't seen in decades, and thank God, because those horn antennas have done more to mitigate noise in unlicensed bands than anything else, aside from other things like friends of mine, like Richard Bernhardt, uh, you know, um, people who have served many years on committees that are helping to open up more frequencies for WISPs. But the 5 gig space was almost unworkable when I was writing about it in the early, in the, like 2004, 5, 6. It was getting really, really bad. So higher end radio manufacturers, I was following them, like Mimosa, slightly higher end, if you will, and um, so if Ubiquiti is now making products that are more scalable for, let's say, the U.S. market, then I applaud that. I don't, our problem isn't lack of product so much, or even that the product is too pricey. Arguably, I don't think we need lower cost radios right now. So I don't know. Like, I don't know how they're going to play in the U.S. market. Is this going to be like? Is there still a price umbrella for radio manufacturers?
they
Um,
seem to be like they got a whole ecosystem of stuff. So like they've announced it in a YouTube video. They've got power solutions, like backup UPS systems as well. They're all managed on their cloud controller, the switches, routers, and things. So it seems to be like a resurgence.
I have a lot of respect for them. I have a lot of respect for a lot of different companies that have different strengths in our industry. Like Starlink, for instance. You
Mm.
know, without Starlink, the Ukrainians would have. I don't know what the status of Starlink in the Ukraine is right now, but without Starlink, the Ukrainians would never have been able to prosecute a war in the early days of the conflict. And I believe that Starlink and low Earth orbit satellite solutions are going to be how we provide resilience to consumers in their car and on the street and in their homes. Because They don't have resilience right now, particularly if they have fiber to the home. But even if they have fixed wireless to the home, the chain from fixed wireless back to the data center is such that that is not going to be a resilient connection as well. So, in the US, there's only one type of critical communication that we say is resilient, and the verdict is out as far as I'm concerned, and that's AT&T's FirstNet. Do you know about FirstNet, Alex?
I've not heard of that. No.
So FirstNet is a multi-billion-dollar initiative in the United States for first responders to always have critical communications access from their cell phone. So to always have a clear and available channel, because we've seen all too often, not just with climate events, but 9/11 and the marathon bombing, that it becomes a huge there's a devastating effect on telecom, and a cascading calamity of issues where, in the end, first responders are unable to access critical communications in an emergency. And so, AT&T got billions of dollars to create FirstNet. And when I say presumably, it means, again, there's no accountability. So I don't know how good that is. We'll have to see. So we supposedly now have a layer of critical communications resilience, but only for one type of user, which is uh, uh, first responders. What my company is trying to do, Climate Resilient Internet, is create and provide resilience for critical infrastructure at the enterprise level. That still is going to leave an entire community unprotected, which is going to be home users and people in their cars. There's an in between part of people that are presently unprotected, and that's going to be all the people who go to emergency shelters. And this is something that I'm going to be chasing after my city of Boston about, because we have places where thousands of people are supposed to go in the event of a storm, and there's no communications infrastructure there. And
Right.
so, what happens when we have, a big storm? We've been very lucky in Boston, but we're going to have these events. And what happens when particularly disadvantaged people who can't afford $400 a night in a hotel room all have to go to these places where thousands of people are, and you can't call your family members, you can't find out who's safe and who's not, how is your house doing, you can't get medical attention because you have no way to connect to the outside world. And still we see in 2022 people on top of their homes with signs trying to communicate with helicopters or trying to get news cameras to find out that there's people in the home that need help. So
Mm.
we're starting something that needs to catch on like wildfire, because communications is really important to all of us. And, we all can turn a blind eye or deaf ear or whatever to it when the problem's not happening. And nobody likes to pay for rainy day or insurance things, but we each have to think about, what if we're that person, or what if we have a family member that's in the hospital at a time where they need critical services, and all of a sudden the hospital can't access MR scans or records that are at a data center. So
100%. Yeah.
for that reason, Alex, I really appreciate the opportunity that you're giving us to tell this story. um, you know we need help with that.
Yeah. It's a really important topic, and
Mhm.
just in the conversation I've had with you the past hour, it's very clear that it needs something to be done. So appreciate you joining me on the show.
Well, I hope you're going to edit this down to something much shorter, because there was quite a lot of a soliloquy going on there with just babbling on and on. But this is a really exciting topic, and I hate to say it, but the wisp industry is so in their own heads about the rural divide, and having this age old tiresome fight with fiber providers, and now we're having to bring the fight to the government, whoever's like providing this money, to convince them that certain wireless should be funded by the government. And we are like we're really spending a lot of time and a lot of effort chasing really difficult propositions. And, and we're calling WISPs heroes because they're closing the digital divide. But I don't know, are we heroes or are we suckers? Because the big carriers got billions and billions of dollars many years ago to bring communication services to everybody, but they brought it only where it was most profitable and they left the rest to us. But, what I want to say to the community is, if you can do well there, that's wonderful. My fear in that business where it's residential is that it's commoditized. It's just waiting for aggregators to come. And eventually there are going to be a lot of small providers that have to sell or just get steamrolled. Um, and I think that there's a whole other side to the business, enterprise, high volume, critical data, where future fortunes will be made, and where secure family fortunes will be made. And I say secure because customer retention is another thing. Customer retention sucks for residential. There's no loyalty. Somebody has a dish up on their roof, and 6 months later, they can get rid of it because somebody's going to save them $12 a month. If you put up something, because you're an airport and it's for critical infrastructure and it's about resilience and it's certified, that's not coming down ever. So there's a story to tell to the industry. So we need the public to get excited, but we also need the industry to get excited to roll this out and to go out and help people.
Definitely, yeah. Cool. I think that's a good place to end. Thank you for coming on the show, David. It's been really, really good to talk to you. It's something I'm really, really interested in, the WISP business and a lot of wireless stuff. So it's been really enjoyable. If people want to get in touch with you, sorry.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I mean, I thank you too. And when I get off the phone and grab my coffee and have recriminations about how I could have done a better job on this, one thing I think of is I wish that you had spoken more. I wish that I had asked you a few more questions, because I think that your experience as a WISP also ties into a lot of what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
So we all have this knowledge. And it's really, a matter of like refining it and going out and selling policymakers on the need to do this. Anyway, to get in touch with me, well, there's a few things. I have a personal website that talks about industry history. If anybody wants to, nerd out on that, it's davidtheodore.com. And my business website is Climate Resilient Internet, or just resilientinternet.com. We have a lot of good information on there, 2-minute videos, white papers on internet vulnerability. And anyone can reach me. Email me at david@resilientinternet.com. I love to talk about this, as you can probably guess. But I really want to get a lot of people engaged in this business. There's a lot of people going to make a lot of money helping to protect critical infrastructure. So we're excited about that. So thanks again, Alex. It's a great opportunity.
Absolutely fine. Yep. And you can find more about the interface at theinterface.uk. We've also got a dedicated website now for this podcast, which is creatorspotpod.uk. And you can follow the interface on Twitter at _interface_. Thank you again for joining me, David, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you.
Much appreciated.